Welcome to Final Fantasy Weekly. I'm Drew Kreisman, and on this episode we have a very special interview segment for you. Don't worry, we're going to get right back into Final Fantasy VIII before too long, but as it turns out, we weren't quite done with Final Fantasy Tactics. Given that we do a series of interviews now, I figured it would be okay to drop this whenever, and quite frankly, my friend Eli, who you're going to hear from here in a moment, and I had been talking about having this conversation for quite some time, since before my brother and I even began our conversation on Final Fantasy Tactics. And I'm very happy that his wife Sarah was able to join us to shed light on this remarkable fascination with this period in real history and the way that it overlaps with some of our favorite stories, most notably, of course, Final Fantasy Tactics, and there's plenty of Game of Thrones talk in here for those of you who are into that. But I wanted to talk to Eli and Sarah because they understand the histories of the Wars of the Roses, and they understand the histories of the storytelling of the Wars of the Roses as done by one William Shakespeare. You may have heard of him. So this was a great conversation to get into. Don't want to delay it much further than that, other than to say there's a lot of history here. There's a lot of names. There's a lot of Henrys and Edwards and Richards that can get a little bit confusing. But I think if you hang with us, you'll find this to be an absolutely fascinating conversation about how art imitates life and why it's important to understand the real histories that help us appreciate stories like Final Fantasy Tactics even deeper. So I can't thank Eli and Sarah enough for joining me. Let's get right to the conversation. All right. I'm very excited to be joined by our guests, Eli and Sarah, and I would love for you to introduce yourselves. Sarah, why don't we start with you? Just tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, absolutely. So currently Eli and I host a podcast called Ripe Good Scholar, which primarily focuses on Shakespeare. Now, Shakespeare's history plays pretty much covered the beginning to end of the Wars of the Roses with a lot of extra. So that is, I started diving in deep, and it got in the weeds of exactly what happened during the Wars of the Roses through Shakespeare. I've always just had a love of Shakespeare, have always enjoyed studying that and studying the history behind it, and so kind of self-taught, but for many years. So coming at this from like excited to talk about my obsession with the Wars of the Roses.
Yeah, and I am mostly the wall she bounces ideas off of while she does really intense research.
Excellent.
But yeah, we're both big Shakespeare fans, and she has dragged me into the weeds of the Wars of the Roses.
Oh yeah.
And I haven't drowned yet, but
Now, my understanding is that, Eli, you haven't quite dragged her in an equal way into the world of Final Fantasy, but there's been a little bit of... You're around it enough, Sarah? I feel like... Because my wife is the same way, whereas like she's around it enough, she's familiar with it, but certainly there's a certain language we you know, if Eli and I started talking where we just
I do that blank stare of like, dear.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes I need to talk about Final Fantasy at her, and she tolerates that. But
because sometimes I need to talk about Shakespeare at you, so
right,
it's all about balance.
Yeah, like if she wants to tell me about the extra behind the scenes from Lord of the Rings, she can do that for as long as she can talk about War of the Roses.
Yeah, that too. That's another obsession. But yeah, so I am familiar some with Final Fantasy. I know I've watched some of it, and I was getting another debrief on Tactics today, so I have a pretty good idea of what happened. At some point, I will say Ophelia instead of Avelia because 100%. It's just too close.
We've all been there. That's actually a great segue to the first question before we get into Tactics that I wanted to ask you, which is about other references to the Wars of the Roses throughout any other literature, movies, television, games, whatever you've seen. Surely, it happens a lot. Obviously, Game of Thrones is one that I think a lot of people are familiar with. It's all over that, right? George R.R. Martin's talked explicitly about that. Yeah.
Absolutely. So probably one of the first artistic interpretations of the Wars of the Roses would be Shakespeare's history plays.
Sure.
Starting with Richard II, which really sets up the conflict for the Wars of the Roses, but primarily through the Henry VI trilogy and Richard III. Richard III is a wonderful play. Henry VI trilogy is a little tougher to get through. But it's very well steeped in history, but kind of a Shakespeare interpretation of history.
It's the version of history where the English just keep winning until they somehow lost the war.
Yeah. They're like, we won all the battles, but somehow we didn't win France. How did that happen? That's weird.
Yeah.
It's one of those things where it's such a broad space of conflict of this one royal family that it's probably inspired a lot that I don't even know about. But to your point, probably most people would be familiar with Game of Thrones. That was inspired by the Wars of the Roses. Of course, there were not as many dragons in the actual history.
Sure.
But a lot of that brutality and sneakery is really entrenched in there. I can't say I know a ton of other interpretations besides now Final Fantasy Tactics that's explicitly called it out. But again, it's such a sprawling thing that, and plus you have the Shakespeare's all over our culture. Sure. So, woman's heart wrapped in tiger's hide. That's from his War of the Roses. Anything from Richard III, Winter of Our Discontent, all that stuff. That's entrenched so deeply in our culture. That kind of indirectly War of the Roses is there.
So can we get, this is going to be the toughest. I hope this is the toughest question of the entire thing, because one of the things actually that Ira and I talked about in our episodes on Tactics is that it's presented as this historical account, and it's really interesting because then there's a lot of things that are left out. And in any other story, we might be like, oh, whatever happened to so-and-so or such and such. But in a real history, there's no way you can tell the whole thing. So tell me the whole thing. No, what?
There will be a multi-part series on our podcast.
Right. You all are going to go very, very deep on this, and we'll talk about that again at the end.
Yeah, absolutely.
What is the Reader's Digest version for the people who might be listening who have no idea what we're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Wars of the Roses happened back in the late 1400s, / kind of wrapped up in the early 1500s. Really, what we have to keep in mind as we discuss this was a conflict that happened over generations.
Right.
It involved at least 3 generations. Now, it wasn't their whole lives, except the middle one there, but it was essentially Henry VI's entire rule. From the moment he got married, at least onward. Basically, what it comes down to is Henry VI was an infant when he became king. He was about 9 months old. So that created a power vacuum, which the nobility were happy to fill.
Sure.
Unfortunately, eventually he grew up, and but he wasn't a very strong-willed king. He was very pious, very religious-minded, and also very sickly. He would actually go into these catatonic states for months at a time. He actually missed his son's birth. But he eventually got married to Margaret of Anjou. And that's where the real problem started, because when he married Margaret of Anjou, he basically surrendered France, which they had just fought 100 years war for France.
Right.
Why did you give up France, sir?
Right.
So that really, the people already were kind of iffy on him because his father was such this strong figure, this strong warlike figure who conquered France, that then for him to just give it all up, they were kind of like, no, thank you.
Right.
So what happened was Margaret of Anjou started putting her favorites into power, who were, they were nobility. It's not like they were nobodies, but they weren't in line for the throne like a lot of Henry's uncles were. And so then you started having this faction of, I don't like Margaret and her evil supporters, and then Margaret and her supporters.
Right.
Henry VI is essentially a non-person in most of the Wars of the Roses. He's kind of the flag everybody's trying to capture.
Right.
I think you frequently describe the start of the war as capture the Henry.
Yeah.
Whoever has the Henry has the power.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Which is essentially what it comes down to. So Henry's faction are called the Lancastrians. They're the ones that are, it's Henry VI, Margaret, their son, and her favorites, the people loyal to them.
Okay.
And then you have the Yorkists, which started with Richard, Duke of York. He had 3 sons, later to be Edward IV, Clarence, Duke of Gloucester, and Richard, confusingly, Richard, Duke of York.
Right.
Which would be eventually known as Richard III.
Right.
So, but while Richard, Duke of York is trying to gain power, he's originally just saying, I don't want to be king. I just want these evil advisors to not be around the king.
Right.
Then Margaret kind of keeps pushing it, and eventually, actually following in relation to the game, a peasants' revolt.
Right.
That's the first time we really see that seed planted of like, but what if Richard was king? And then he starts laying down the lines for his legitimacy. This is where now we're in full blown war.
Like I'm in there, I'm hanging in, but I was like, I feel like now it's going to get complicated.
Yeah, now we're in a full blown war, and I won't get too much into the weeds of that. You know, we have key battles, and the War of the Roses is really just a series of key battles and trying to hold your homesteads, your main territories.
Right.
And so, you know, you have, now we have Henry, now they got him back. This one battle, he's literally just sitting under a tree.
Right.
Just chilling. And they're like, oh, look, we found the Henry, we win. So you have a lot of back and forth. Richard, Duke of York, is eventually killed in York, which is humiliating for the family.
It's brutal, but at least that makes it easier to remember.
Yes, exactly. And this is where his son, Edward, marches into London to claim London for himself, to claim the throne.
Yeah.
We keep fighting. Edward gets exiled. He comes back. Henry gets exiled. Again, it's very easy to get deep in the weeds of the back and forth. But essentially, at the end of the back and forth, Edward is king. He's married to Elizabeth Woodville. They're producing a ton of kids. And, but his marriage angered his key ally, which was the Earl of Warwick, and his middle brother. So they go to get Margaret of Anjou and her son out of exile in France to instate her son on the throne. So they come back and they swoop in, Henry was still alive at this point. He was just imprisoned. It gets confusing, especially when I don't have the timeline in front of me.
You're doing great.
And
I've got it.
And so they briefly reinstate Henry. Edward runs north, amasses some forces, comes back, frees his whole family. They were in sanctuary, and Edward's now king. Edward has a pretty good reigns for, I think, around 20 years.
Yeah, I think
so. We have a couple decades of peace here. And then Edward dies, and Richard III famously, allegedly, executes his nephews and instills himself onto the throne. People are not a fan of that, because even in those days, child murder was frowned upon.
Sure.
And so then you have Henry Tudor swooping out of nowhere and win. He marries Elizabeth of York, and we start the Tudor dynasty, ending the Wars of the Roses. That is as short as I can make it.
Excellent work. Excellent job. Yeah, no, and obviously for anyone who knows Final Fantasy Tactics, you hear a ton of parallels. It's like with Game of Thrones or whatever. It's never going to be a one-to-one. That would be boring. That's not what good writers do. They're borrowing on some of those things. I do want to dive into a few of these, and I got to start with King Baby. Eli, we talked about this as we were doing the Final Fantasy Tactics episodes. There are basically 2 figures in the story, one of whom is a toddler, who is supposed to be the king, and the other is this young woman named Ovelia, who there's a lot of intrigue about her, and I think we see this with Sansa Stark also in Game of Thrones. These young women who are forced into these weird royal arrangements, and everyone trying to get power through them, even though they don't really have any power of their own. And then there's this weird, interesting twist in the game where she might be a body double. Like, she might not even really be of royal lineage. So so speaking of confusing or whatever, right? How much of that the toddler should be king, as an excuse for, like you said, an uncle somewhere, how much of that, and so the toddler, the children and the women, I guess that's the question I'm asking, right? It's the toddlers who we say should be on the throne, and then the women who may have the better claim, but they're just being used, which we see all throughout Game of Thrones. I was wondering if you could highlight some of those characters.
So I think there are a couple, just in the War of the Roses, there's a couple instances of child kings. There's Henry VI, who, his uncles and cousins formed the Lancaster faction, and they were trying to control him. And he was, even as he became an adult, disinterested in rule. And it's very interesting that, the two characters who kind of fulfill Henry's role in tactics are Princess Ovelia and the baby who's completely off screen.
Right.
Because
never mentioned, right.
Well, and the thing is, in history, baby kings are almost always a bad idea.
Right. I would think so, right?
They almost never work out. And Henry actually lasted a pretty long time. Like, he actually made it to being like a proper adult king, kind of. It was his own personality that prevented him from actually ruling. But most of the time, all babies do is create power vacuums.
And speaking of his personality, there's some real overlaps with Ovelia that Sarah pointed out earlier, that he was pious, he was peace-loving, he didn't like the idea of being at war or fighting for things, but he was so attached to this idea of peace that he failed to control his own country and led to decades of war that killed 100,000 people.
Right.
And I will also say, kind of just as another kind of kid in the mix, Henry VI's son is actually, who was probably named Henry because everybody was named the same.
He was an Edward, actually.
Oh, he was an Edward. Okay.
So that's our third Edward. And
I was going to say,
I think 6 Henrys and 8 Richards.
Oh yeah, there's a that's part of the reason this all gets confusing.
There's one George.
Right.
Just the one George. But his son was born probably kind of during the calm before the storm time, and was raised in war. By the end of the war, he was fighting in the battles. I think he was still a teenager.
He was. Okay. I remember this. He was 16 years old when he finally fought in a battle, and it was not the battle to be fighting in if you were a Lancaster.
Didn't go well for them.
Make it. And this is where the parallels with the game get interesting, because if I remember correctly, Ovelia is with kind of the white lions with the 3 sons, where
Ovelia's with the black lions with Duke Goltana.
Well, she's kidnapped by them, but
she's kidnapped by them.
Yeah, so she's, a lot of it is Henry. So even though the got there. This is where this whole conversation is going to get complicated, because there are just so many people, in both the game and the history, that it, and that's where I think too, just slight tangent with the Shakespeare history plays. A lot of people struggle because of all the names, because it's hard to follow, because you don't know the history. And if you don't know the history, you don't get all the references, and it's hard to follow what's happening, which is why I like doing stuff like this, where it's like, you can get there. It just takes
because now if you know this stuff, it'll make sense, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And so, whereas in real life, the Lancasters were the ones supporting the child, but because the Yorkists didn't have an heir directly from a king. And what I mean by that is like a king's actual child.
Right.
We're talking a couple generations removed from a king
Right.
that they're trying to make a claim to the throne. And oddly enough, part of Richard of York's claim was actually through his mother, which was super sketch. Yeah. Because everybody was like, no, sorry.
Right.
Try again. That's a woman.
It's a really interesting story. Basically, one guy was passed over for the kingship, and his family never forgot it.
Pretty much. Yeah. Basically, Edward III, all of his sons were skipped over because his oldest son died young. And we had a baby king, Richard II, who, plot twist, turned out to be a bad king.
Right.
Because baby kings are bad ideas.
Bad idea.
So you had this whole generation get skipped, thus creating an argument for, well, it really shouldn't have gone to the baby. It should have gone to the next heir, the next son, not grandson. Right. Which is really, and that, again, we're talking a couple generations back, but that's how far back this goes. This is a deep family fight.
Right.
It was actually called the Cousins' War at the time because everyone involved was a Plantagenet. They were all these royal cousins and dukes, and what started out as an argument over who should guide Henry became, I want to be king. No, Henry's king. No, I'm going to be king. And, 100,000 people died.
Right. Which, since you mentioned that, that's actually two things that I want to talk about because Final Fantasy Tactics has they reference the previous war a lot and in fact that a lot of people who were fighting against each other in the War of the Lions were allies in the 50 Years' War. Dukes Gultana and Larg would have fought alongside each other, along with House Beowulf and everyone there. So the idea, again, that everyone's cousins, like that, I think is a very clear crossover. But the way that really plays out in Tactics is with the normal people. So I want to ask about that. There's this, we talk a lot about the Corpse Brigade as kind of the main symbol for this. These people who basically weren't paid from the previous war. They've got nothing. They're running out of food and resources. And they say, to hell with all of this. Cousins fighting cousins over toddler kings. We're just going to burn the whole thing to the ground. So what were the people in the streets? What was the feel like during all of this nonsense?
So kind of what's interesting about that question is history tends to focus on the royal families.
Right.
A lot of the common people would have been lost in the shuffle. Every battle, we'd have numbers, but we'd know which nobles died.
Right.
We know which important people passed away.
Right. You did mention a rising up at the beginning, though.
Yes,
there was something,
I did. So Eli had mentioned in the game, there's like a peasants.
This is the Corpse Brigade.
Yeah,
the Peasants' Revolt.
Yeah.
So it's really, as Eli was explaining it, it almost seems like a combination of actually two different rebellions. So prior to the Wars of the Roses, while Richard II, our first back a generation baby king, he was like 12 or 14 at the time.
Yeah.
There was the Peasants' Rebellion, where the people, and what had prompted that was actually the bubonic plague, had created a labor shortage. Sure. And so they tried to say that laborers could not try to go to a better paying lord's land. They had to stay with their lord, which they were like, nonsense. I want to get paid a fair wage.
Right? What is this, Walmart? You can't
exactly.
do that.
So, and it's funny as you read about it, and this is where I felt like the motivation behind the revolt in the game pulls from the Peasants' Rebellion during Richard II's reign, because it's almost like socialist. Like, it's like, this is very progressive.
It is. It's
for
wild.
the
Yeah, the Peasants' Revolt, they were like forming committees and discussing what policies and how, and overthrowing the whole kingdom. But unfortunately, they thought the king would be on their side to a degree.
They did at the end. So what the nobles did, because they didn't want to go out there and face the angry mob, they threw the preteen out there. They're like, here, baby king, it's your time to shine. And he actually did a really good job. Like it's one of the crowning moments of his reign. It all went downhill from there. He peaked at 12.
One good thing.
And but kind of what's funny about that is he talked down the crowd. He calmed the revolt. He was like, hey, like, I'm going to work with you guys. And they were like, okay, sounds great. Let's all go home. And then he killed the leaders and was like, just kidding. No, thank you.
So maybe not one good thing, but one not failure.
Oh, yeah, man.
He successfully squashed the revolt. Let's put it that way. Now, during the Wars of the Roses, during the time of Henry VI, we had Jack Cade's rebellion, which hilariously we actually do see in Shakespeare. He's the one that said, first, let's kill all the lawyers.
Oh, already. I love this guy. This is a hero already. This guy's right out of the Final Fantasy you wrote him. He's a warrior of light. I love it.
Exactly. And he's the one. And so what they do is they're like, you know what? We're sick of these horrible advisors to the king. We need a real king, a good king. Let's go march on London. So they did. And they actually successfully took London.
Wow.
I want to say the royal family actually left London as they were like realizing what was about to go down.
No kidding.
They just were like, bye.
Why isn't this a movie? I'll watch that movie all day. Watching the royal family get chased out of London by a bunch of angry peasants sounds amazing.
Well, the peasants.
I'll say the royal like Henry and Margaret, they get chased out of London a lot during the War of the Roses.
They do. They're very rarely route in London.
It's like, out the back door again, Margaret. Grab the kids.
They just had the bags packed all the time. If Henry was like catatonic, they'd just be like, all right, chuck him in the cart, let's go. So Jack Cade was trying to keep control over the mob, but essentially now it was mob rule in London. And
also usually not a good idea.
They successfully captured and killed some major figures in London. I believe the Lord Mayor, and I know the Cardinal, and I think a couple other nobles. They like beheaded and were like, we're in charge now. Now, this is where we first hear mention of Richard, Duke of York, should be king. It's rightfully his lineage.
Almost.
Because the Henrys, the Henrys were descended from the third son of Edward III, John of Gaunt. That's where the Henrys came from. Okay. Richard, Duke of York's mother was descended from the second son. Now, his father was descended from like the fourth son, but it's that second son that he claimed the lineage should have passed.
Much closer, yeah. But through mom, so...
Yeah, but it would have been...
it would have gone to someone called Edmund Mortimer, and then through his descendants, it could have passed to Richard.
See, this is why they wanted to kill all the lawyers.
It gets silly. It gets silly fast.
Technicality, not if you count it this way.
To be fair, though, Richard's response to this was, I'm in Ireland. What's happening?
Yeah. So in history, there is some speculation as to whether this was kind of Richard from a distance, like feeling out how people would feel about that.
Yeah.
And then it went south pretty quick because they descended into a mob and started murdering people. So not a great way to start. So he hears about it, possibly knew about it the whole time, but hears about how bad it goes, quickly runs back from Ireland and is like, I had nothing to do with this.
Hey,
I don't know what's happening. I don't want to be king. And
I don't know if either of you are current on House of the Dragon, but there's that great scene where Alicent basically just says, I didn't mean all that. And it's like, but you did, though. But didn't you, though?
Did.
Yeah, I'm very much enjoying House of the Dragon.
Yeah.
Finished now, but...
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's, and that's a different part of English history, right? But that is that Henry VIII, where it was the will someone rid me of this troublesome priest or whatever? I think.
Oh no, that was Henry II.
Okay, so I think that's where that whole concept comes from, right? Of like,
I've got to be honest, the fact that I can now divide the Henrys in my head like that, I blame entirely on Sarah.
Phenomenal.
Although a lot of kings would kind of be like, oh, wouldn't it be great if this guy just wasn't around anymore? And then
Right.
someone in the room would go and kill him.
Just
The
gonna
king
say
would be
it
like,
out
how
loud.
dare you?
Yeah. First of
Tell
all,
you to murder anybody? How dare you?
But yeah, you can see, although a big difference between the Corpse Brigade and these other peasants, to get back to what we were discussing, which is that these peasant revolts tended to focus on, well, which of the nobility is going to be the right ones for us to work with? Whereas the nobility always knew the answer was none of us were going to squash this rebellion.
Right. Yeah, that is one of the things that is much more progressive about the peasants of tactics, is that they recognize pretty early on, like, no, they're all bad. Let's just burn the whole thing to the ground.
Yeah. And I think what you have to keep in mind with the peasants at the time is that there was no other form of government.
Sure.
Like it was, and God chose the king. We can't depose God, then we're going to be condemned. So yeah, and I think that's where, we can look back and be like, there's other forms of government, guys, but they didn't see that.
Right.
And even though the divine right of kings was not as entrenched in England as it was in, say, France, it was definitely there.
That's a really great segue into what I want to talk about next. So you had just mentioned, the idea of the king being chosen by God, which is a great way to start talking about one of the other huge themes in Final Fantasy Tactics, which is the role of the church. Now, in that story, it's this very kind of like seedy behind the scenes. They're pulling the strings so that the church can get more power. But in the real world, if you can kind of name the king, like they didn't really, but I know, I mean, that did happen at times throughout history, right? There were times, but I mean, how much power and influence does the church? Because if everyone's saying, well, God is the one who should decide who sits on the throne, I would think the church would have a little bit of a say in who he would pick. Yeah,
I think to a degree, the Catholic Church didn't have that great a hold on England. Richard II believed deeply in the divine right of kings, but then Henry IV believed deeply in having a bigger army than Richard, and then he became king. And after that, Henry VI was very pious, so was Henry V. But once the War of the Roses started, Henry IV, back in the day, during the 100 Years' War, when he overthrew Richard, he proved that in England, the biggest army made you king. So Edward IV and Richard of York, when they started pursuing the crown for themselves, they kind of stopped paying attention to what any intermediaries said. Edward IV won over Parliament and had himself crowned king. And then he drove Henry out of England, and Henry was in France for years. And then, there was a back and forth. And it wasn't until, I think, when Edward's brother Richard imprisoned Edward's sons in the Tower and then eventually had them killed, that's when you really start seeing religion creep back into it. Because even as far back in Rome, people were praying for the souls of the princes because this was such a shocking thing to the medieval world. I think there was, Sarah, there was a Feast of the Innocents, I think.
Yeah, the Feast of the Innocents is a Christmas thing, part of the 12 days of Christmas, especially in Tudor times, but would have been in medieval times as well. I think the important thing, though, to keep in mind is that the church was essentially a power player. They might not have picked sides, as in, like, the Pope said Henry VI is supposed to be king, because, England was so far removed from Rome. Like, you had to get on a boat and then travel across Europe to reach Rome. So it would take a long time for the Pope to get involved. However, the cardinals, in particular, were often appointed by the king. They were some of the king's top advisors and top family members that would be appointed to high-ranking places in the church. So it wasn't so much of, especially in England, like the Pope going through his cardinals and decreeing what would happen. It was the king's appointed cardinal saying, yeah, the king's right, guys. Now, what you would see a lot more of, because the church, well, you had sanctuary. Just to backtrack a little, you had sanctuary where the church, if you went in and you declared sanctuary, that was it. You're done. There's no fighting in the church. There's no murder in the church.
Right.
They cannot go in and get you. Edward IV's wife, Elizabeth of Woodville, and her children spent a lot of time in sanctuary, actually. Like, for years. He was exiled, and she stayed in the church.
Wow. Yeah.
Now, it was like Westminster Abbey. It wasn't like
sure, but yeah,
sleeping on church pews, but it was still kind of a big thing. So that was, while the church wasn't necessarily quite such a behind the scenes political machine kind of thing, they definitely had a role, but also there was still that reverence to God. Throughout history, even English history, you would see, like, I'm having trouble coming up with a War of the Roses example right now, but Henry IV kind of did the thing I was talking about before, where he was like, oh man, wouldn't it be great if Richard II just wasn't around anymore? Because he was in prison, but as long as he was alive, there were people who could reinstate him. And so he was like, wouldn't it be great if, like, Richard just wasn't around? And then someone killed him. And he was like, what? How dare you? I didn't tell you to do that. Now I need to go on a pilgrimage to, the Holy Lands.
Sure.
And
right.
There was always this sort of reverence of, even if I did something really wrong or something was really done wrong in my name, I have to make it right with God. Because if the Pope had come down and been like, Edward IV is wrong, he should not be king, you're a little screwed. Because at that time, to be excommunicated would have been a huge deal. And we don't see that happen till Henry VIII, that he gets all of England excommunicated. Just go, Henry.
Excellent job there.
Excellent job. Good job, Henry.
But and to a degree with that, like, these pilgrimages were also a good way to launder your bad reputation. To say, oh no, this happened. Look, everybody, don't get mad at me. I'm making up for it through performing these rituals. So there's a degree to which genuine people trying to make right for things that happened, but also just rulers could make a show of feeling bad about something, and people would accept it.
And all of the nobility would have felt strongly about supporting a church. So Henry VI was extremely pious. He would have given a lot of money to various churches. But a lot of the people that held power at the time would have also been huge patrons of churches. They would have donated things and money and paid for the priest or the bishop or whoever. They would have really been heavily involved because, again, that was a bit of a reputation thing, but also like, let's keep the church on our side. Nudge, nudge, God.
Right. It's well, it's like it loomed, right? It's almost the way I'm understanding. Like you're saying, it's like they maybe don't get as directly involved until later, or the way they do in the tactics story, but just knowing that they could had to have absolutely changed the way that these people behaved.
Well, and you will see less of kind of the church as a huge institution and more of like a cardinal or a bishop or someone will get heavily involved.
Right.
Because they did have power. They had real political power at the time. That's why, maybe not your firstborn son is going into the clergy, but maybe your second or third is probably going to go into the clergy because that was actually a pretty powerful role to hold.
Yeah. All right, now I've got to ask you this question, and there might not be an answer to it, but I've just noticed this is definitely a thing with these fantasized versions of it. Both Game of Thrones and Final Fantasy Tactics are heavily built around the hero bastard son. And is that just like a TV Hollywood creation thing? Like, we love that thing, but are there these hero bastards, or at the very least famous, like noble, not born of the queen, but presumably there were plenty of kings who were fathering children from not the queen. But did they ever play a role, or is this something we love as a storytelling device?
So there are a lot of bastards we know of that are, they're named in histories and were acknowledged and had power and authority, because to a king, especially a king of England, I think, you want your family to have the heir and the spare, but there are multiple times when a king's heir tried to overthrow him or rebelled against him.
Sure.
Bastards were, your son. They're still your flesh and blood. They're still loyal to you. You still support them and train them up to be a knight or something and give them lands. And they're not going to stab you in the back to try to take the throne.
Because they don't get anything when you die.
Exactly.
It's like that whole I just can't wait to be king song is a little darker when you realize that Simba is like, hey, dad's going to die.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
Wait, what?
I just hope you stay alive. Yeah,
right.
That's so.
There's one little boy in House of the Dragon who's the only one who mentioned it. We won't give spoilers to people, but he's the only one who was doing the math. He's like, you understand that in order for me to get to sit in the big fancy chair, all these people have to die, right? And they're like, don't worry about that.
Don't think about that.
I am worried about that.
Well, yeah, especially as you start looking at the broader families, there's a good number of people that have to die for anybody to get the throne.
Right.
Now, what I will say is, we didn't really have the bastard son who was legitimized and raised to power and was a hero of the
Sarah,
people.
Tell us that happened in real life. Give us that. No,
but we did have a lot of people claiming that people were illegitimate. Actually, hilariously, kind of if you're looking at the three sons of York, the youngest, who I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the protagonist's name of the game.
Ramza.
Ramza would have, as the youngest son, would have been kind of Richard III, a little less murdery of children.
Sure.
But
Hopefully.
because of Richard III's deformity, his especially in Shakespeare, you see it, and this was kind of a twist of history to make him seem worse. Now, he did actually have a bit of a hunchback.
And this is a Tyrion comp as well, right? I've heard that Tyrion Lannister, the imp, is sort of based on this person.
Yeah.
And like we saw with Tyrion, there were a lot of claims that he was illegitimate, that he couldn't have been a legitimate son.
Sure.
Of course, because he was deformed, it must have been the woman who slept around, because obviously God's okay with men sleeping around.
Yeah, it's in the Bible.
They produce normal children. But, so you had that. You had kind of that question. And then actually Richard, upon trying to seize the throne while his nephews were imprisoned, claimed that they were also illegitimate, that they were not Edward's true children. So there was a lot of claiming of people not being legitimate sons. Now, what's kind of interesting of our kind of the hero bastard son raising to power, well, Henry VII was not a bastard. He was legitimately born. Henry VII, Henry Tudor, had a very weak claim to the throne. It was partly through his mother, but his father was Henry V's wife's second marriage.
Right.
So it was sketchy at best.
Yeah, I think his mother was descended from a line of John of Gaunt that was explicitly disinherited from the throne by an act of parliament.
Yeah, I think he was from the second. I think she was from the second wife of John of Gaunt or something like that. Or it gets complicated the more you look at everything. But he had a very sketchy claim to the throne, which is why the Tudors pushed so hard, especially to make Richard III sound terrible.
Yeah,
it's also why in any telling of the War of the Roses, you don't mention Henry Tudor until you're like, well, then Henry Tudor showed up and won.
Yeah. Yeah, like, yay, he won. And so that's probably the closest we come to in this story. While he's not kind of the bastard son coming from behind, he is kind of the well, he came out of nowhere and now
the
he's
underdog.
king.
Yeah. Like, all right.
He is the inspiration for Delita as well.
I think so, right? Yeah.
Yeah. But I will say in English history, I think that maybe I think the most heroic bastard that at least gets lionized in any of Shakespeare's histories is probably Philip the Bastard, who just has the best lines in that whole play.
Hilarious. Yeah.
And a phenomenal full title. Yeah.
He's literally like, his whole claim to fame is that he's a bastard son. And
Love
he's
it.
like, well, I'm going to lean in. This is my personality now.
That scene in season 1. Never forget
although,
what you
I
want,
guess
bastard.
if we're going to do a deep dive way back in English history, William the Conqueror was a bastard.
Boom! There we go.
That's
so
fantastic.
The whole start of the English royal line was a bastard son of France. So
there we go.
We got there.
Got there.
That is tasty. And that gets to another, and this is a big topic. So again, we'll do our best with it. But one of the meta themes of Final Fantasy Tactics is that it's presented as an historical account, and they tell us right at the beginning, like, a version of history that says this is what happened, but this is what actually happened. Like, that's our framing, right? And as you were just saying there was a telling of the story for a while that made, I'm not going to get the right number, Richard
the third,
the Tyrion one. That's how I'm going to remember. Right, out to be more potentially grotesque or terrible than he actually was. So how much of this do we know? And how much of this are we putting together from the sources who told the story at the time? And, how much can we know?
The good thing about the Wars of the Roses is that the person writing the key history, Holinshed, was not that far removed. He wasn't alive at the time, but he was the court historian during Henry VII and Henry VIII. So he wasn't very far removed. Okay. End of Henry VII's reign. So there would have been people whose probably, father or grandfather was involved.
Were there, yeah, sure.
So it's not so far removed that, kind of to compare it, like Roman history, where they were writing back like thousands of years before the historian was even alive. So who knows?
Just filling in blanks and stuff, and then
and there were some contemporary accounts too. There were so as far as medieval history goes, we have a pretty good idea. We can point to this battle and say this person died. Sometimes we can say what the wound was.
Yeah, so especially with the nobility, and that's why, like I said before, we always know which nobility died in a battle, because we know when they died. We kept that log. Rules of Parliament, some of them we have. There was a fire at Westminster Abbey just before the Victorian period, or a little before the Victorian period, and history time.
And the Parliament building also caught on fire, burning a lot of documents.
Yeah. So, but we did have some firsthand accounts. You would have had nobility writing home. You would have had we do have accounts of the ambassador to Rome writing back to Rome. We do still have some of those correspondences. Some things we're never going to have. Some things get lost, like we just said, paper is unfortunately very easy to destroy.
Sure.
Fire, water, pretty much anything will eventually destroy paper.
Blows away in the breeze.
Exactly. And you also had, you might have had peasant who fought in the battle and wrote about it, but his family didn't feel that journal was important, so they threw it away.
Sure,
or burned it, or whatever. Mm-hmm. So a lot of it's lost, and a lot of it we're never going to know for sure. Like I said, the big history is Holinshed. That's where a lot of people pull from. That that's where the bulk of the story comes from. That's where Shakespeare pulled from. That's where kind of we have the most just straightforward. But we have to always keep in mind Holinshed was a Tudor historian. So his job was not just to record history. It was to record history to make the Tudors look good.
Right.
So we can't exactly be calling attention to the fact that the Tudors had a super sketchy claim to the throne. We have to call attention to the fact that Henry VII came in and defeated the evil, grotesque, deformed Richard III, the child murderer, and then he married Elizabeth of York, joining the two sides, and everybody was happy, and peace reigned in the kingdom.
Sounds nice.
Until Henry
sounds lovely.
Yeah. It does.
Yeah, and so that's the version of history we're trying to tell. But as far as we can tell with contemporary records and other accounts, it's pretty accurate. He's not talking about, anybody riding a unicorn or a dragon into battle. We're not getting into legend like we would with like King Arthur or people like that who maybe existed, maybe didn't. We don't know. We're much more grounded in reality because he's not so far removed.
Right. No, that's probably the biggest parallel, right, Eli? Is that and we talked about this at the end where, like I said, the beginning is you think so-and-so is the hero. He's not really the hero. There was this other guy, you should know his story. And the guy you think is the hero, in this case, Henry Tudor, maybe is a little more of a gray area character than history remembers him. And that's exactly where Tactics leaves us with Delita. And it's not, he was actually an evil. Well, it's up to everyone's interpretation of his actions. You just realize he did some stuff, and his claim was tenuous, or Delita had no claim. He just killed all the right people, which is essentially the same thing we're talking about here, right?
Yeah. I will say Henry Tudor didn't claim the throne through his descent. He claimed it by right of conquest. So he just was like, we're going to ignore my whole family history. Let's not pay attention to that.
Yeah. And presumably he would have wanted some historians to tell a nice version of his...
and there's, to a degree, like the nice version where he defeats Richard. Like, we have Richard's skeleton. He did have a hunchback. We dug up the skeletons of two children who were buried under the Tower of London around that time.
Actually, interestingly, sidebar, they might get DNA tested now.
Really?
King Charles has said he would allow it.
Please.
Queen Elizabeth would not.
Yeah, Queen Elizabeth was like, I don't want to know.
No kidding.
Yeah, because there's actually bloodline there.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So
because the Tudors, that's who the current royal family descends from, right?
Henry VII's daughter, because Henry VIII's line died out.
Yeah.
But Henry VII's daughter, that's who they claim descent through.
And married into the Scottish throne. And,
right.
Yeah.
And that's a whole other movie.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Several of them.
Henry VIII is a movie all on his own, and then we have the Scots coming in. It gets crazy.
How many movies have Elizabeth I have? Come on.
Oh, yeah. I mean, she's awesome. I love Elizabeth I. But, it's interesting because while he never really claimed through his actual lineage, although there is kind of there, it wasn't like he just was like a nobody. If you're talking about trying to retain a kingship through right of conquest, you have to make people want you and your family to continue ruling.
Right.
And that's what Henry VII was trying to do. And that was his challenge to do. Now, Elizabeth of York had a decent claim to the throne. Her father was literally a king.
Sure.
So that helped. But it was... If we've established now that a king can be removed, which is what Henry IV did with Richard II, now we've established a king can be removed. What happens if you're a bad king?
Right.
Which is what Henry VI found out.
Right.
Yeah, and a lot of Holinshed's chronicle was about how, look how much the War of the Roses tore us apart. This is clearly punishment for overthrowing Richard II. And that was Henry VII's big propaganda thing. Like, why do I deserve to be king? Because the Lancasters and Yorks are all were all complicit with this act of overthrowing kings. And you know what that means? No one should overthrow a king.
Exactly. and you know, what I found interesting was
starting now.
When I was reading the summary, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that Delita and Avelia got married and then like stabbed each other.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's a really interesting thing because you know, Henry VII married Elizabeth of York, and that cemented his claim to the throne, and Delita does the same with Avelia. But I think who's the head writer of Tactics?
Yasumi Matsuno.
Yeah, Matsuno. Matsuno was, I think, very empathetic to Elizabeth of York, who spent a lot of her childhood in monasteries, hiding from armies who wanted to kill her. Her uncle killed her brothers, murdered them.
Tried to marry her.
And supposedly tried to marry her, but tried to make nice with her family and use her as a political pawn. And she ended up siding with Henry Tudor, who was her father's enemy. And at every point, she was this political pawn who didn't have a lot of agency. And it seems like Matsuno, looking at that, wanted Ophelia to act out against being this pawn, to act with agency, and unfortunately she seems to die at the end. It gives a little call after he stabs her, and it's very depressing, but he tends to look at the lives of these people who are grabbed up by politics, and he asks us to empathize with them. And you know, it makes me look at Elizabeth of York's history with a bit of sadness. Yeah,
Elizabeth of York sometimes gets a bad rap because whether or not Richard III proposed to her like he did in Shakespeare and in Holinshed, she was around his court even after her brothers disappeared.
Yeah.
Her and her mother both were. But for them, that was, you know, we had touched on earlier kind of the role of women, that's how they stayed alive, was not making a big stink with Richard.
Right. 90% of the time, and not to do too much of this, I'm Team Green all the way. Or I'm sorry, Team Black all the way. I'm Team Black all the way. But when whenever somebody says, I can't believe Allison would do X, Y, or Z, 90% of the time I go, well, what other choice? Especially the first big one, where they're like, I can't believe she would marry the king.
You're talking about
betray her friend that way. And I'm like, what was she going to say? No, I'm not marrying the king. So again, it's like Ophelia has almost known Elizabeth of York. You know, what were you going to say? No. And now you're buried right next to him. Right.
Yeah. And I think the women of the time in both the Game of Thrones universe and House of the Dragon and probably the game to an extent and certainly real history, women held a lot of soft power. Actually, if I can recommend a book, Philippa Gregory wrote a book called Women of the Cousins' War, where she talks about all the women kind of working in the background.
That was my final question for you. So if you want to elaborate at all, because we have Agrius, the Holy Knight, is this phenomenal character in Final Fantasy Tactics. Brienne in Game of Thrones, these incredible warrior women. I was hoping that there's some reality there and that it's not an entire fantasy, maybe not the badass war, but playing some kind of a role. So here.
Probably the hard part of that is, so I have two answers. Hopefully it did. Probably if it did, we don't know about them.
Okay.
If there was a woman she in reality never would have been knighted. She would have just been fighting in the battle.
Or Mulan, everyone would have just believed she was a boy, right? You could have just gone that way with it. And
so you would have had it's very, and we're learning more about it now as we kind of are better at tracking things in history, and not so much with Wars of the Roses, but just in general in history, we are finding more women fighting in battles. Probably a woman did fight in a battle.
Right.
Now, War of the Roses, Margaret of Anjou was not necessarily fighting, but present at the battlefield. Now, Margaret of Anjou gets a bad rap.
I've heard the Cersei comparison.
She's painted as this huge villain of the Wars of the Roses. She was manipulating the king, and
to her, if I could step in, she came from a province of France that during the 100 Years' War, the women ruled the province and governed it while the men were fighting this war that had been going on for a century.
Sure.
And so when she came into England, she came in with the expectation that she would be governing and helping make decisions. And a lot of Englishmen really chafed at that because they were, what words am I allowed to say?
Okay, I can bleep you if I need.
Fucking dicks. But they, at the same time, I think part of her reputation is a bit earned. I think one battle that stands out, there were some knights on the York side who they weren't really Yorkists, but they were there to protect Henry while he was present at the battlefield. He'd been kidnapped by the Yorks and was their bargaining chip, but these knights had tagged along to help keep him safe. The Yorkists lost that battle, and as the Lancasters took the camp, they found Henry with these two knights. And Henry, the King of England, asked that these knights be spared, and Margaret of Anjou turned to her then 8-year-old son and said, "My dearest, what deaths will these knights die?" And he said, "Behead them," little child voice. And as the King of England, now absolutely powerless, was calling for mercy, they were beheaded. So she had some fire.
That is some Cersei Joffrey stuff right there. That is, yeah.
For sure. But I think that to come to her defense a little bit here,
right?
I think that had she been a man, no one would have said anything.
Of course.
She would not be this demonized person in history. And even that exchange, while not good, I think she did acknowledge the reality of the situation. I think had we left the decisions up to Henry VI, that war would have lasted so much longer because he would have kept trying to make peace. Because Henry VI, at some point, when it looked like Richard of York was gaining power, he was like, okay, how about this? I'll stay king, and then after I die, you're heir apparent. His son was born at that time. And Margaret was like, excuse me? Like, you have a son right here. You have an heir. And he was like, well, let's just to keep everybody calm, how about Richard's king next? Like, everybody gets a turn.
It's
that
like
was
how
the
America
kind of
had one election where the guy who lost became vice president, and then we realized that was a really stupid idea.
Yeah,
exactly.
And so
then Jefferson was like, "This is dumb."
Yeah, I'm not doing that.
And so there was a degree which she was the person who was thinking practically,
right?
And maybe if she had been born Queen of England, then someone with a spine would have been able to make the call, and England would not have descended into this horrible civil war.
Well, and traditionally in history, the king and queen, you needed a queen. The king was supposed to be the strong head of the land that brought down justice, that he was kind of more of the hard line, whereas the queen traditionally should have been the one asking for mercy.
Right.
So really just what you had there was the roles were
they
reversed.
Just flipped it.
They flipped the roles. And I think that's...
Offended the historians.
Yes.
The accountant, the people, and that's how she got turned into a monster, right?
Yeah, and I mean, you see that
role.
You see that multiple times throughout history when there's a strong queen.
Right.
It was Edward II, I think. His queen was known as the She-Wolf of France.
Yeah. She did supposedly skewer him with a hot poker.
Well, yeah, but he also pushed her aside for his favorites.
Yeah. He was not a great
favorites.
king
either. So it's these women kind of being more practical. Like, this is not how it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
And acting on it.
Live your life in such a way that your wife never wants to skewer you with a hot poker. At least it's not enough to follow through with it.
Right.
Hashtag goals.
Yeah, right. That's only slightly less catchy than the happy wife, happy life thing that people say.
Exactly.
Mine's the poker, the skewer poker thing. I just got to stay away from getting skewered. Hey, I could literally do this forever,
Yes,
but we do need to wrap it up. I will say I have a little bit of homework for you, Sarah, because you're going to come back on the show when we do Final Fantasy IX. We have to talk about I Want to Be Your Canary and Shakespeare. Eli will fill you in on all that if he hasn't yet.
Sounds great.
That'll be much more Shakespeare than history, I think.
Perfect.
Yeah, there's a playwright named Lord Avon.
Yes.
Yeah, that's going to be insane. So if not before then, I'll be very happy to have you both back. But before we go, plug your show and let everybody know what's going on there.
Absolutely. So Ripe Good Scholar, we believe our goal here is to kind of bring the history and the context to the plays, because I think that makes them much more fulfilling, which is why a lot of times we do get into the weeds of the Wars of the Roses. Upcoming here in January, we are going to start minimum a 3-part series on the Wars of the Roses. I could see the middle part of the actual chunk of it during Henry VI taking 2 episodes, but we'll see how it goes. We'll see how long we talk about it.
Right.
Beyond that, kind of if anybody is interested in, I'm not sure when this is going to air.
I'll get it up in the next couple of days. Just throw it on.
Okay, yeah. So that'll be coming in January. Kind of in the meantime, we have episodes on Richard II. We have episodes on Henry VI. I actually have a very interesting episode with my friend Lisa, who is a psychologist, where we diagnose Henry VI, who, like I said, would go into these very long catatonic states. So you'll see, if you're interested in the War of the Roses, particularly, we have a lot of episodes that tie into that. But again, just kind of history in general, Tudor history, even a little more modern history, that's really where we focus on when it comes to Shakespeare. Like I said, tune in January when we're doing our multi-part series, because, as I said, we could talk about this literally forever.
Yeah. I'm excited.
Complicated. Thank you.
I'm going to have to check in on the diagnosis one, too.
That's a fun one.
Yeah.
That's a fun one. For sure.
Yeah, the best ones are the ones where I get replaced by Lisa.
We do have fun.
And can people find you on social media?
Yeah, absolutely. So pretty much at Ripe Good Scholar on Instagram in particular, a little bit on Twitter, as long as it's still standing. Yeah. And we do have a Facebook page. It mostly just feeds from Instagram. Instagram's our big one. And then, of course, on pretty much any podcast platform you listen to, again, the podcast is Ripe Good Scholar. If you have any trouble or have any questions or comments or whatever, you can email us at ripegoodscholar@gmail.com.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode. Thank you for listening, and thank you again to Sarah and Eli for coming on the show. I don't know about you, but I learned a lot during that hour and can't wait to do it again. As always, thank you to all of our Patreon subscribers, and if this is your first time here, please consider a $1 a month subscription for all of the Final Fantasy content. And if you're interested in conversations like this outside the realm of Final Fantasy on Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, and a myriad of other topics, please check out patreon.com/DC Productions. And for you YouTubers out there, be sure to subscribe to Everything is Final Fantasy. Thanks again for listening, and may you forever walk in the light of the crystal.